Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Next Generation Infrastructure and Industry 4.0 stage at CogX 2021. My name is Laura Foster, and I am the Programme Manager of Tech and Innovation at Tech UK. And thank you so much to CogX for partnering with Tech UK today and inviting me to chair this stage. For those of you who don't know, Tech UK is the UK's technology trade association, dedicated to creating a network of innovation and collaboration through technology for people, businesses, and government. And we're also dedicated to creating a better future for society, the economy, and of course, the environment. It is wonderful that you're able to join us here today, either in person or virtually. However, you can also join the conversation on Twitter with hashtag CogX2021, and also feel free to tag Tech UK with just @TechUK. Now, today we have some really great sessions coming up, exploring different emerging and transformative technologies, including 5G, cloud, edge computing, and one really exciting conversation happening a little bit later on today on quantum commercialization. Throughout all of these sessions, we'll be exploring who the ingenious minds are driving the next digital age, and also looking at the real-life use cases which are creating extraordinary shifts in every sector. Now, technologies never work in isolation, and through these sessions, we want to showcase the convergence of emerging and transformative technologies for digital transformation. I'll be staying with you throughout the 2 days on this stage. However, I am now really excited to introduce the first session for this CogX stage, which will be exploring transformation for enterprises with non-public 5G networks. And I am excited to be joined by Caroline Gabriel, who is the Research Director at Analysys Mason, and Iain Thornhill, who is VP at Service Providers at Ericsson. Hi, Caroline, it's lovely to see you.
Hi, Laura, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me to take part in this session.
Welcome.
Great. Well, thanks, Laura, for that introduction. Looks like a really great programme in this Tech UK stage. So thank you again for inviting me to be part of that. As Laura said, I'm Caroline Gabriel. I'm a research director at Analysys Mason, and I head up our practice looking at networks, in particular 4G and 5G networks, and operator investment strategies across all kinds of infrastructure, both wireline and wireless. And as Laura just referred to, the sort of convergence of many of those technologies is a key issue for us at the moment. Together with colleagues in Analysys Mason, I've certainly been focusing very heavily on non-public networks in the 5G era. We're seeing this as a very key trend as many industries start to use mobile connectivity for a lot more than just email, you know, really supporting mission critical processes and making 5G in particular part of their broader digital and process transformation activities. I know we're going to talk a lot more about that in conversation with Iain, which I'm really looking forward to. We certainly believe that these trends will significantly accelerate the rollout of wireless networks in general to support enterprise and industrial use cases that have sometimes been challenging to support from public networks alone. And now we're seeing the convergence of many demand factors and also enablers to usher in really a new era, I think, of network business models for cellular. In fact, this market's so interesting and important that at Analysys Mason, we are currently launching a brand new programme which is dedicated to private networks. According to our most recent forecast in this area, we're expecting over 20,000 non-public 4G and 5G networks to be in action by 2026. I know Iain and I are going to discuss quite a lot which verticals are driving this and why, but you know, as a heads up, we're seeing certainly manufacturing, mining, ports, petrochemicals being the sort of sectors that are driving adoption and really investing very large amounts of money into these very groundbreaking deployments that I think we'll discuss today on this conversation. Of course, they have particularly demanding connectivity requirements, so they really are capable of driving a whole new approach to cellular networking in some cases. there are so many technical and commercial aspects of this movement that are fascinating to discuss. So I'm delighted to be here with someone who's seeing many of these developments really at first hand. Iain Thornhill, as Laura said, he's VP for Service Providers and IoT at Ericsson. Iain, would you like to say a few words about yourself, and then I know we'll get into a fairly informal, free-flowing conversation about what we're seeing in this market.
Firstly, good morning, Caroline. Super pleased to be here to talk about something which is very close to my heart, which is the adoption of 5G in enterprise. My responsibility at Ericsson is I look after the service provider and IoT business, but my majority of my day job is looking after the development of new use cases with enterprise and proving the return on investment required for that kind of adoption of 5G. So I'm super excited about it. Really, this is great. I get to talk about what I want to talk about for the next five minutes.
Great. Well, obviously we want to focus today really about the benefits of 5G for business. So perhaps that's a good place to start, what we see as being the main value and benefit. Because as I said in my introduction, I think, although of course there've always been private wireless networks, some of those have been proprietary, some have been 4G based, but nothing on the scale that we're starting to see now. And part of that, I'm sure we'll come on to some of the technical enablers, but of course there has to be demand driving this. And I wonder what you see as being the main benefits that companies are seeing that's driving them to make these are substantial investments. They often involve a lot of disruption to their processes and the way they do things. So companies are not going to deploy non-public networks lightly, I would say. So what's your thought about the benefits that they're looking for over the first few years of their rollouts?
So I think if we rather than focus on the technology to start with, maybe I'll start from the other end. So in terms of from the enterprise perspective, this is all about the digitization of all of their processes and manufacturing techniques, or in other industries, about their end-to-end processes. What we're seeing is everyone needs to be more efficient, everyone needs to be more flexible, and automation is absolutely key in driving all of those types of use cases. So the end game is all about being more productive, being more efficient, building a competitive advantage in any way, and that's what's driving the underlying use cases. It's the digitization that everyone wants to do in order to be more competitive, and then we need to look at what are the enablers to make that happen, which weren't there before. So the enablers that we see are threefold. You need to have reliable, low latency connectivity, which is available anywhere. And when we say anywhere, that could be from a sensing or IoT device right the way through to a tablet, to a machine, to an edge device. Then on top of that, you need to have the ability for the application to process all of that data. And that's where we see the overlap between the edge technology and AI. And so what we're seeing is a whole bunch of new use cases coming out which rely on that connectivity. The connectivity is the enabler for all of the different use cases which come. And that's what we're seeing in many of the use cases. It is an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem required in order to deliver the benefit to the enterprise. And the ecosystem ranges from the connectivity partner right the way through to the edge provider and the application sitting on there. And the applications range, the huge range of applications, right the way from monitoring and health sensing through to AGV, autonomous vehicles, and machine learning techniques as well. So.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And I think something that we've noticed, we did a survey last year of about 400 enterprises about their requirements for not just for 5G, as you said, for the whole ecosystem for edge compute and many emerging sort of technologies. And I think when I went into that, I was making an assumption that in most cases, these enterprises would already be perhaps using 4G or some kind of private network, or they would have gone through the process transformation and made it all on fixed lines, and now they just want to mobilize it. But in fact, we found very strongly, and I don't know if you see it, but that a lot of this is brand new. These are enterprises that for the first time are thinking about bringing in something like, some new advanced robotics or whatever it might be, something they've never done before, and that they see 5G as enabling. And that was something that was surprising to me, is how much new thinking there is, rather than just mobilizing old processes, if you like.
Absolutely. It's all about getting hold of the data, isn't it? It's about, getting hold of the data that can help an enterprise become more efficient, become more flexible. And up until now, I think a lot of that data has been locked away in siloed processes or machines or technologies. And I think what the industrial 4.0 is all about is freeing that data up, getting it into one place, being able to analyze it and make it actionable to actually improve what an enterprise wants to improve. A very easy use case to take is ports, for example. Today, many of the cranes and the whole movement of traffic within a port is done in isolation by one crane operator, by one supervisor, and it's not running as a holistic port environment, which is able to coordinate all of the different activities. And that's where you see some of the earliest use cases really coming to life. Yes,
absolutely. And that sort of brings me on to that issue of which vertical sectors are driving this. I mean, I think I hinted at it in my introduction, but we certainly see at the moment this is an industry that is being, heavily pulled along by certain large enterprises and sectors where they have a particularly demanding requirement, as we've talked about, or they're going through particularly radical transformation. And then later on, others perhaps can learn from these groundbreakers. But certainly in our forecasts and surveys, we're seeing that industry 4.0 and particularly the manufacturing sector itself being a huge leader of deployment and creativity. I think, Ericsson's got quite a few big manufacturing non-public network projects that have been quite high profile. I'm sure there's lots of others that are less public, but yeah, I wonder what verticals you're seeing. We're also certainly seeing that any industries that have a lot of remote critical infrastructure seems to be a strong one. Public utilities, petrochemicals, mining. I know everyone uses mining as their best example because it's probably the most remote and difficult of all, but real investments going on there. But we're also seeing some in what I call more sort of carpeted office sort of environments, some finance, retail, big enterprises there as well. I wonder what's your take on the vertical markets?
Yeah, so I think there's if I break it down into different sectors, I think there's no doubt that the ports, transport and logistics sector is leading in the UK. There's a huge amount of work going in to see if they can increase automation in these spaces. So that's clearly coming from low latency video based use cases, which can enable them to automate the movement of vehicles or all processes across the entire sector. So they're definitely leading. We also see an awful lot of adoption in the utilities sector, where you're effectively using some of the easier use cases, if I'm honest with you, such as monitoring and tracking, hazard and maintenance sensing. And you see that across all the utilities, from oil and gas through to water. And ultimately, this is about the ability to utilize a very high density number of devices, but being able to post-process all of that data in as fast as possible. So we're definitely seeing a lot of movement there. I mean, including things like wind farms, where they want to get more real-time information related to the maintenance of the wind farms, etc. So I think they're the two. And then the third subset, I would say, is manufacturing. I think manufacturing, the use cases there rely on pretty much all of the above that you've seen in terms of the ports, in terms of the oil and gas, etc. So manufacturing is using sensing, and it is, there are return on investments to be had from just being able to predict exactly what an air conditioning unit is doing, exactly what a power unit and when it's likely to fail with predictive maintenance. There's some of the earliest and best return on investment we see actually uses the more basic functions, and then they build on those and then start getting into the harder use cases with video and analytics running over the top to bring in those kind of use cases. And that's where, obviously, in a manufacturing environment, you will start to see autonomous vehicles and robotics and cell-based production techniques trying to be improved for efficiency improvement.
Yes, absolutely. And that sort of obviously all this data processing that you're talking about is becoming hugely complex, and a lot of adoption of machine learning and AI is clearly going into these non-public networks. I suppose AI is an obvious one, but are there other technologies that are emerging sort of in parallel with 5G that help us to answer the question of why now? Why is there this huge explosion of interest? And certainly we see it as being the way that you can use 5G to help you exploit other technologies like machine learning, like edge compute, different spectrum schemes. I wonder what you'd pick as being sort of the most important technology enablers that are making these networks happen.
Yeah, I guess what we're seeing is that they're all three running in parallel to bring the digitization that the enterprises need. So the super reliable, low latency connectivity available for everyone requires edge compute to be able to run the applications as close as possible to the actual processes that you're performing in a secure and very high workload. And then on top of that, you need the application and you need the strength of AI and intelligent learning to be able to either post-process it or process it real time to give you the use case. I mean, a great example of one which we're working on a project with BT and a company called Hyperbat, where effectively the R&D center, which was based in Oxford, wanted to connect real time into the manufacturing processing plant, which was in Coventry. And what they did was they effectively utilized the capabilities and the low latency of 5G, but ran that using edge technology, but ran that so that they could have an AR overlay. So the CAD engineer could test out real time what his battery would look like in terms of positioning within the car with an AR overlay. And it seems like a relatively straightforward use case, but it had to utilize the full end-to-end ecosystem of all different partners in order to make it happen. And and what's the benefit at the end of it? Well, the benefit is relatively straightforward. It reduces the amount of time to get a design change into the production line from something which would apparently took somewhere in the region of 3 to 4 weeks, took 6 months, reduced to 3 to 4 weeks. So it was a huge game changer for them in terms of their flexibility as a manufacturer. So yeah, that's the kind of use case which I really see the full end-to-end benefit of edge as well as AI at the same time.
Absolutely. And at Ericsson, do you find that all this means that you're working with different partners with a very different sort of ecosystem to the one that you'd have for the public networks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's happened actually is the recognition that you can't do everything on your own. You need to have a very, very strong ecosystem partnership, which we have. You need to be open. You need to use open standards in order to make sure that everyone can add value along the supply chain. We have a brand new ecosystem environment which basically welcomes almost anyone to be onboarded and be brought into a sort of 5G ecosystem and to test and to come up to speed with what it is that we're doing. And yes, it's testing us because, you know, there's so many fantastic application providers out there that we want to provide them with that brilliant connectivity for, and ultimately we need to learn how to collaborate better. So yeah, it's slightly different, but I also would say the CSPs are, you know, the operators are learning to collaborate, but also the hyperscalers and the edge providers are all working together. It's all comes down to the same thing. What's the return on investment for adopting digitization for an enterprise? You know, there's no point doing any of this stuff unless there's a return at the end of it for the enterprise. And we're starting to see very clear business cases which get there. I mean, we're talking anywhere from a 6-month return on investment to a 2-year. And it's not as big, you know, it's not as long as you would think. So, you know, we are starting to see the return on investment time frame coming down, and also the benefit really as much as 5 and 10x.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. We just remind the audience that we will have a short time at the end of our conversation for any questions. So if you do have questions, do put them into the chat box, and we'll look at those at the end of the main session. But sticking with the sort of topic of edge compute, because clearly 5G and edge compute are a sort of dream combination in many ways, and we're talking about these sort of use cases. But when we did our enterprise surveys, and there was a lot of interest in edge, and a lot of what the enterprises were saying was often sort of driven by edge, and then they thought about what they could do with a very distributed cloud, and then they looked around at how that would all connect up. And however, I think perhaps the edge compute ecosystem and platform is less mature than the 5G one. I mean, 5G, we've got to our second release of standards. We've got all the promised capabilities like support for ultra low latency that have been in development really for a decade. Do you think there's a bit of a mismatch in the sort of progress between how mature the edge side of the equation is, and is that progressing well for these non-public networks?
I think it's accelerating very rapidly at the moment. I think there's a recent discussion between our CTO and the NVIDIA CTO where they were talking about it. I genuinely do. I do see that it's coming very fast. I think the model for adoption will be wide. There'll be different approaches. I think some will be wanting to keep everything on-prem, totally secure in one place as an edge device, and it may even have no connection to a public cloud vendor. And then others, I think, are going to go more for a hybrid approach, which we see a very fast adoption of at the moment, whereby you only take the data off the site that you need for very heavy lifting on the data processing for AI or intelligent processing. So we do see that. I think there is still barriers that all parties need to overcome, because enterprises to a certain degree are more used to running and controlling all of that themselves in their own IT systems. But I think the benefit will outweigh the reticence in many enterprises, because when they can see the power that you can bring to that data and to the analysis and the applications that you can bring in, I think quite quickly you'll see this adoption.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we were actually quite surprised by how many enterprises indicated that while they might start doing things on premise, they were kind of looking for a more hybrid solution, for a high quality managed edge or public edge solution. I mean, we've done a lot of sort of analysis of the opportunity there for the CSPs themselves, because of course they're going to be building out edge compute in many cases to support their own virtualized networks. And I think that's a really interesting sort of convergence of, well, if you're going to build a cloud that's as high performance as that for your 5G network, then you could also monetize that for enterprise. And so, I think there are some really interesting sort of partnerships and cross investments, co-investments coming up, which in the past, your network infrastructure would have been a whole different business case to how you might support enterprises if you're an operator. But now we're sort of seeing, well, perhaps all this comes together in some cases and becomes much more of a converged platform that can support all kinds of different, different applications, including the network itself.
Agreed. I mean, the network's the enabler. It brings together all of the application. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate the value of the actual application developers themselves as well. I mean, you can have the fastest and best sensing network in the world, but if you haven't got an application which is saying, well, public safety application, which is saying that this particular person is moving into a danger zone and is working all of that compute out in the background, then it's not useful. So it's a combination of very, very strong application players that come into the ecosystem, a very strong edge, and then underneath it all, 5G is the connectivity to glue it all together. And open standards is the key, and collaboration across the ecosystem is what Ericsson are very, very strong on.
Yes, absolutely. I think ultra low latency tends to be almost the most fascinating aspect of these non-public network use cases, because it's all the robotics and the the sci-fi aspect of it all. Yeah. But actually, in our survey, when we asked enterprises about their drivers for a non-public network, low latency was, of course, important, but it was outstripped quite significantly by privacy and security issues, and just that need to control your data, and particularly in Europe, know exactly where it is, which sometimes seems counterintuitive in a cloud world, but is incredibly important to a lot of enterprises. I mean, do you see that as a big driver of non-public network?
I mean, it has to be ultra secure. It needs to be able to be compliant with our very stringent and correct GDPR and data privacy laws that we have both in the UK and Europe. And so, yes, that actually I see is why you have this great marriage between 5G, which was designed to be secure from day one, with edge compute, which obviously enables all of that data to be kept in the right place in order to adhere to the privacy and also from a security perspective. So it's that combination which I see is really working really nicely. And I also agree that the most advanced use cases for the ultra low latency are the sort of poster boys of the private 5G. But the reality is, as I said, people are going to save themselves an awful lot of money from sensing, from just getting data from places that they haven't got data today. And that requires very high demand data. It requires video. And it requires a high density of sensors across, whether it be a factory, whether it be a port, whether it be an airport. I heard a great use case just recently where a hot dog vendor, it's not actually a hot dog vendor, it's a well-known chain actually, but a well-known food and beverage was putting sensors into their shop within an airport to work out when the peak flows of people were coming through the airport, so that they could put food and specific foods on at certain times, so that they could always have the right food available on the area. And it seems like a basic use case, but it's saving them a fortune on wasted food. If you've got constant fresh sandwiches always available, then you're actually wasting, because half of that goes in the bin because it only has a certain lifetime. So yeah, things like that, which is a very basic use case, but requires quite a significant amount of data processing in order to draw out that really nice kernel of insight, which is what I believe Industry 4.0 is all about. It's about pulling nuggets of information out to make enterprises more efficient.
And that's a good example of an application that, as you say, in some ways is simple, but it's very core to the business of that enterprise, but also has a broader sort of social economic impact, because we all know that reducing food waste is a huge issue around the world. So many of these things go beyond the enterprise efficiencies that they are originally delivering, and then have an impact on the much broader world. And I think that's a really great example of that. We're actually, amazingly, at the end of the time for our main conversation session, but we do have a bit of time to answer a couple of questions. So if you're happy to do that, Iain.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one question is, we've talked about these very big enterprises that are clearly leading the way and have very complex requirements, but what about the smaller enterprises, medium-sized companies perhaps, who can also see that a non-public network would benefit them, but don't have these huge resources to invest in cutting edge? I mean, we certainly see demand bubbling up there, but at the minute, perhaps with a few exceptions, like some of what's going on perhaps in the CBRS world in the United States, some of that's more geared to smaller companies, but in general I think this remains the preserve of large companies for now. I mean, do you agree, and do you think there'll be solutions that come along for the smaller companies?
I think we're coming out of the trial and demonstration phase of the adoption of 5G and moving into the mass commercialization. So it is inevitable that the biggest enterprises and some of the use cases that we're seeing are from the biggest companies with ports and airports and transport and utilities. So I think that's inevitable that they're going for it first. But what we do also see is very, very strong demand from the medium-sized business. In order for that market to flourish, our job as the vendors is to provide a 5G system which is extremely simple, very, very easy to integrate and operate, and at a very low cost. And I think I would say that in Ericsson private 5G, even in the last 18 months, the development and the improvement in both the miniaturization of the product down into just one server, the ease of integration into the IT systems, that's been our focus, and that's where we see very quickly this medium-sized enterprise going, and our portfolio is now catering for both the small to medium size as well as the biggest use cases in an airport or a port. So I do think the technology is helping this adoption, but I also think that the use case can be applicable for a very large international company, and also can be potentially applicable for a small to medium sized business in the UK. Ultimately, it's the return on investment and business benefit that comes from the use case. As long as that is there, then it can be applicable to medium-sized business. And we do see quite a lot of interest coming through from retail, from warehousing as well in the UK. And some of the applications, such as push to talk for security firms in retail, is an interesting one, and they want their own dedicated private network in order to achieve that. So there's lots of different sectors in the small to medium-sized business, which I think will flourish over the course of the next 18 months. Yes,
absolutely. And we also see a lot of interest in retail in particular. Lots of really interesting use cases there, and more customer-facing ones. So yes, I think there's, it's really exciting to see some of those platforms developing that will make it easier for those smaller companies. Perhaps a lot more managed services, cloud-based services. We saw that in the Wi-Fi world, and I think it will be the same in cellular as well. For sure,
it's going the same way. I mean, as I said, I think now you can literally get one server, you can install it yourself, you can operate it yourself, and there's someone there looking after it as a managed service. So yeah, it's definitely going the same way for the small to medium size application for sure.
Yes, absolutely. We just sort of mentioned Wi-Fi, but there's actually another question from the audience, which is, whether you consider Wi-Fi a competitor within the private network space, or could private 5G replace Wi-Fi in some campus networks? I mean, this is a difficult one. My personal view is that we've probably spent too much time as an industry saying it's cellular versus Wi-Fi. And I think probably in the 3G, 4G eras, they both found their space. I think cellular was really a wide area, highly mobile, wide area kind of network, and Wi-Fi did really well in homes and the carpeted office. And there's an extent to which that won't change if you're just talking about basic connectivity. But I think with the sort of use cases we've been discussing today, which are very diverse, very mission critical, are often going into environments that haven't had Wi-Fi so far, or haven't had any kind of connectivity. To me, it seems that there must be a role for both of these technologies. And yes, perhaps in a port, cellular is the thing that you need, and Wi-Fi doesn't have too much of a role, except maybe in the office that controls the port. In other sort of some of the manufacturing environments, you can certainly see that each of them has strengths. I mean, obviously Ericsson's involved in lots of complex projects that presumably have lots of Wi-Fi hanging around. So I wonder what your view is on this one.
So I think, we should go straight down the line. I think clearly there are many instances where 5G is actually replacing Wi-Fi infrastructure, but we absolutely see it as complementary in other use cases. So it depends on the use case. Sometimes we see that actually having the 5G low latency and high bandwidth connectivity, then connecting into a Wi-Fi hotspot is a potential way to do it, whereby you've got a brownfield site where you've got a bunch of technology in there. It might be the most cost efficient way to do it. In other instances, it does, there is a look at doing a replacement strategy, but we don't, I would say complementary. Certain use cases, Wi-Fi still has a place, absolutely. And then in other instances where you've got very high mobility or low latency, then I think 5G comes into its own. So, but they can be complementary, and I don't believe that it's an exclusive one or the other.
Absolutely, yes. I think we certainly agree on that, and it would be nice to see, I think, both the ecosystems perhaps cooperating more. I think the deployers actually use both technologies, and there's a lot of cooperation at that practical coalface. Sometimes you'd like to see all the stakeholders in both ecosystems just stopping talking about which of us is going to win. And
too much time has been spent on this topic, I think.
Exactly. Yes, so I suspect that they will become even more complementary because, as you said right at the beginning, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all in this new industrial environment. Every single enterprise will be different and have different requirements, and there'll be a different balance between different types of connectivity. And of course, there's still lots of industry-specific connectivity, and that's that is in things like railways, obviously, or factories, that has to be taken into account, and the fixed line connection. So all it's, I think it would be unusual to have a private 5G environment that's greenfield. I know there'll be a few, but I'm sure with most of it, it'll be about making the best of all the technologies that are everything needs to be utilized in order to draw the data back. So I do see integration buses becoming an important part, whereby you'll have 5G present, Wi-Fi present, as well as other technologies. So I do see that integration bus for everything, and it really depends on the requirements and the demand of the actual use case or application, which will decide whether or not you can utilize a Wi-Fi technology, or whether or not you need something more robust in a 5G. That's my honest, straight take on it. But I do think they'll be present together for a long time. But yes, absolutely. Well, it's great. It's been a really good discussion. It's
been a pleasure.
I've enjoyed to talk about this with you, Iain. Yes, absolutely. It's been really enjoyable. Thanks for the questions from the audience. I hope that you in the audience have found this interesting and stimulating, giving you some food for thought, and that you'll enjoy the rest of Tech UK's stage and other streams within CogX. But anyway, I'd like to now hand back to Laura to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Caroline and Iain. It's never easy to be the first group to get started on a stage today, and you've both done such a wonderful job and set the bar really high for other discussions happening here today. Something that Iain said really stood out to me on that, which is it's the role of vendors to really make non-public 5G networks simple and easy to integrate, which means it's moving more from the larger big players and now becoming more accessible for SMEs, which is exactly what we want to be seeing and what we want to be encouraging through these discussions. Another thing that really came up on this session as well is the importance and the role of edge computing. And I'm delighted to say that a little bit later on today, we will be having a further deep dive into the role of edge computing for Industry 4.0. All that's left to say here now, though, is thank you once again to Caroline and Iain for joining us here today. And please do stay around, because at 11 o'clock, we will be having a really interesting conversation with Blue Prism on intelligent automation.